Walt.
Derek. Audience.
Welcome to Startup Grind. Welcome to California.
Thanks. I've been to California before, but thanks.
You did not arrive in an Uber today.
I did not.
Tell me what we should in the ride sharing companies. What educate us a little bit. How should we put our dollars behind something? Should we care about it? Are these just startups competing in a big market? What's your take?
Well, they are just startups competing in a big market, but I'm a capitalist. I believe in free market economics.
A lot of capitalists here.
And I think one of the features of capitalism is you get to vote with your dollars. And I have, just speaking personally, ever since the Susan Fowler memo came out, I vote with my dollars for Lyft. And that's what I use. I mean, you asked me, so I'm just answering, but I think you should do that in lots of walks of, lots of your commerce choices that you make. And sometimes there isn't a reason other than price or quality or that you like something better than another. And sometimes there are issues of how they treat their workers or what things they've done. I know that Uber is in the process of change, and I hope they do change. But right at the moment, I'm still
pro Lyft.
I'm happy with Lyft. It works, at least in the United States, and that's what I use.
Well, you've seen a lot of, so I'm sure everyone here does know you. You've interviewed some of the greatest entrepreneurs of the last 30 years. You've written about most of the greatest technology products of the last 30 years, some of the worst, through your columns. When you see these people off the stage, whether it's CEO of somebody like an Apple or founder of an Apple or Microsoft or somebody else, or maybe a CEO of an up-and-coming kind of company, what is different from what we see in the public of these people, or the way they are versus the way they are in private? Are they who we see in the press? If the things that we read about Steve Jobs, or the things that we see of Bill Gates, are these the people they are?
I mean, it really depends on the person. Obviously, if you're on a stage, so Kara Swisher, my partner, and I, when we started the D conferences, which became the Code conferences, we decided the idea for the onstage part. Of course, there's always networking and other things going on at conferences, but for the onstage part, that we would try our best to do an interview on stage that was as close to a journalistic interview or conversation that would take place off stage as we could be. And we did. I think we did at least, but you can't ever get a perfect copy of the offstage experience, because offstage, somebody will say, well, can I go off the record to tell you a little background about something that I'm not prepared to be quoted about? And of course, on stage can't do that. And then, people they're wonderful, amazing engineers, product managers, CEOs, not just in tech, but in all fields, who are just not good on stage. They're just not good on stage. It's not part of their job, maybe, or they weren't hired for that, or it's not part of their personality, but they nevertheless make huge contributions and have a lot of, and so if you have a private conversation with them, it's great, but they don't want to go on stage, or you convince them to go on stage and they're not nearly as compelling. There are other people who are actually better on stage sometimes than they are in private, and that's just a personality thing. There's lots of people that put on conferences who are great on stage, and there are other people who probably should have conferences, but they're not that good on stage. It's just a thing.
We hear a lot right now with entrepreneurs and startups about how this is the easiest time it's ever been to start a company. You can get a product live quickly. There's funding is everywhere. There's so many people that want to be involved. Tell me why I'm wrong.
You're not wrong, but it's not as simple as that, and here's why. I'm sure everything you said is true, but it depends what your goal is. If your goal is to start a company and have an exit in a relatively short time and get rich, or at least rich, make a bunch of money, and your goal is not to build a great company, I don't think this is I do think that's fine. You'll do fine today. I think if you want to build a great company, and everybody in this room, and the lights are such that I can't see everybody, obviously, but everybody in this room needs to remember that Microsoft, we were talking about it backstage, Microsoft was a startup with 10 or 12 people in Albuquerque in 1974. Apple, famously, you all know the story, was a startup with 2 people. Actually, there was a third guy who quit, kind of missed being a billionaire. But they were a startup, and both those companies IPO'd and all that. And they built great big companies. Facebook built a great big company, Amazon and Google, you know that. The problem with doing that today, if that's what you want to do, is because we have a concentration of power, unlike anything we had in, let's say, the 90s, the 80s, the 90s, and even the early 2000s, we have a concentration of power of these 5 big platform companies. You're very likely to get an offer that you can't refuse if your product is a threat to one of these companies, or even if it's not a threat, if it would just, they decide it would help their business. So that's great if what you want is an exit. Not so great if you have a fiduciary responsibility to your investors and you want to go long-term and build the next Apple or Google, but you get a big offer from Apple or Google. And so I just think the dynamic is different than it was.
Yeah, and these guys in the late 70s or early 80s, they went public. There was no one to buy them, really, because they had their path. Hey, I'm going to have to IPO. I'm going to have to figure out a real business. There's no golden parachute waiting for me.
I mean, there was IBM, and there were a few of these companies that made mainframes, and there were some companies in Boston that made what were called mini computers, which were about the size of a refrigerator. But they didn't believe in PCs.
Yeah.
They didn't believe in personal technology. Generally, they were all about, the head of IBM, one of the previous heads of IBM was once quoted as saying he didn't see the need for more than 5 computers in the world. Well, a company like that is not going to buy Apple. It's not going to buy Microsoft. Microsoft was an entirely new kind of company that just sold software. I mean, now, as you know, it sells computers, but it only sold software for a long, long time. So your point is correct. Nobody was going to buy them. So and plus the nature of their founders was such that they were out to build big companies.
So this is what's interesting, and I wonder if you could correlate this for us. You have these guys, and they seem, reading back, everybody's competitive today, but these guys so competitive with each other to the point of you could never imagine. Reading it, the things Michael Dell said about Apple or the things that Jobs said about Gates, you can't imagine those people working together. We see it today. Most of the up-and-coming companies, they're all funded by the same people. They're all going to the same retreats up in Half Moon Bay in the hills.
It was a different situation.
Were they more competitive, or was it just those people?
No, they were very competitive, and that's not just them. There's a lot of companies that have been forgotten that were around, and that were also very competitive. But even they had relationships of commercial relationships. It wasn't necessarily friendships. So we were talking about it backstage. The Apple II, which was really the first impactful personal computer that people who weren't necessarily hobbyists could maybe use. It took a lot, but you could use it. The basic programming language in there was written by Microsoft. Apple got it from Microsoft. And there's a whole story associated with it. You can watch the joint Bill Gates, Steve Jobs interview that Karen and I did. They tell the story there. The Mac, when Apple did the Mac, there was only one other prototype Mac. There was only one outside of Cupertino, and it was at Microsoft, because Apple wanted some third-party software written for it, so they asked Microsoft to do it. And you got Microsoft Word and sort of a graphical version of it. That, ironically, taught them how to do graphical software, which led to Windows, which led to the demise of Apple as a PC maker and almost going out of business. You know all this, but so people were competitive, but where necessary, they bought things from each other.
You reviewed many, if not all, of the most important hardware products of the last few decades.
And software. I reviewed
and software. Excuse me.
Yeah.
What is it going to take for hardware to get easier? What is in your mind are these barriers?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways hardware is easier now. Some parts of hardware are easier now because there are companies like Qualcomm, there are companies like others where you can buy system on chips and sensors and stuff like that is on the market. You can buy it in Asia. These kind of giant Asian supply chains just didn't exist. So some aspects of it are easier. What's harder is to differentiate, and you see it in smartphones. Really, only 10 years after the iPhone came out, and 9 years. I mean, this year will be the 10th anniversary in the fall of Android, and that may seem like an eon to you, but 10 years is not an eon for something like that, and yet it's awful. You know that it's awful hard to break in and do something radically different there. So the new fields, AR, VR, AI, autonomous driving, robotics, all the things you all know about and probably are working on, a lot of you, those are more greenfield things where if you're doing hardware, you have an opportunity to do something